Meghan Meyer, who's an assistant professor here at Dartmouth. She did her undergrad at Emory and then spent some time in France working on a master's where she met John Bassetti did some work. She also did a little stint in China with an Shiga Homenzai. And then she completed her PhD with Matt Lieberman at UCLA and then a short postdoc with Ed here at Princeton. And then today, she's going to hopefully tell us a little bit about rest, the social brain at rest, and maybe some links to memory. So, welcome, Megan.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm actually surprisingly not going to be talking about rest and the role of social memory consolidation during rest. That is sort of the majority of the work going on in the lab right now. However, I tried to spin things a little bit closer to the theme of cognitive maps this year. So we're going to go over some new projects in the lab that are a little different than most of the stuff we've been thinking about. And before I get started, I just wanted to thank Jeremy, Matt, and Luke for obviously organizing such an awesome Mind conference. I've been seeing what you guys are, talking about on the Slack channel, and I can see that there's like so much excitement, and it's really fun to see. And I also wanted to give a big shout out to the two folks who did a lot of the heavy lifting for the two projects that I'll be talking about today. Andrea Courtney was a graduate student in my lab and is now a postdoc at Stanford, and Alex De Silva is a current graduate student in the lab. And both of these folks are really awesome scientists, which you'll get to see for yourself in today's talk, which is going to be all about social connection. And when talking about social connection, social scientists tend to differentiate between sort of two sides of this very broad construct. On the objective side of things, this tends to refer to our actual number of social ties, our actual tendency to get out and interact with others. So folks studying things like social network size or social network position, the really elegant work by Carolyn Parkinson and Talia Wheatley, as well as studying whether you join memberships in the community and actually engage with others in conversation. This is the objective side of social connection. The subjective side of things refers more to our internal experience, sort of what it feels like to feel connected to other people that are actually in the social network. And so we're actually going to go over studies on these two different aspects of social connection today. First, we'll go over projects led by Andrea Courtney in the lab that focus on this subjective feeling of being connected to others. And then we'll switch gears sort of halfway through the talk and go over a project that Alex has been spearheading, looking on the more objective side of social connection. So first, let's just start with this subjective experience of feeling close to others. And I think Daniela Schiller mentioned this briefly in her talk just now. If you ever listen really closely to how people describe their sort of internal experience of feeling connected to others, you'll see an interesting pattern, right? You tend to hear people say things like, we're really close, we're from a tight-knit community. You may see people go like this to indicate that they're really tight with another person, right? We're overlapping. And on the flip side of things, as we start to feel sort of disconnected from the people that we care about, you say things like, we've grown apart, or he's been really distant. And psychologists often refer to this idea or this component of social closeness as self-other overlap. In fact, it's theorized that the more emotionally close you feel to another person, the more you start to include them into your own representation of yourself. Sort of if you have a schema of yourself, you start to drop in attributes of the other person into your own self-concept, hence the name self-other overlap. William James speculated on this. Again, this is a very old idea in psychology. He wrote about it when writing about our relationships with our friends and family. He wrote that when they die, a very part of our own selves is gone. If they do anything wrong, it is our shame. If they are insulted, our anger flashes forth as readily as if we stood in their place. Now, although this is a very old idea in psychology, this old idea of self-other overlap, it actually hasn't been very rigorously tested. So really the one and only way by which social psychologists are currently testing for this construct of self-other overlap is shown here. It's not only the gold standard, it's really the only standard by which social psychologists try to test this idea of overlapping representations. And we can see off the bat there are a number of issues, right? So first off, it's a single item questionnaire. Participants are asked to think about someone they're in a relationship with, indicated by the X, and with just this one question, indicate which of these Venn diagrams best reflect their relationship. Another issue here is that it's unclear if the way participants are answering this question actually maps onto what the researchers end up interpreting the response to be, right? So the researchers, if you make a 6 or a 7, use this as evidence that you have an overlapping representation, like a mental structure with the other person. But of course, participants who aren't trained in cognitive psychology or social psychology, who knows what heuristic they're using when they make this assessment. And even if they were making the right appraisal of the question that's consistent with what the researchers are interested in, this is not exactly rigorous evidence. I'm sure folks in this room wouldn't take this as rigorous evidence that the underlying cognitive structure between the self and others is actually overlapping. This is just a pick your picture that best reflects things. So Andrea and I wanted to know if we could do better, right? Could we develop a more rigorous way to test this really old idea of self-other overlap? And the following kinds of results guided our thinking. So we've actually known for a while now that portions of medial prefrontal cortex will preferentially engage when participants think about themselves, but also to an intermediary degree when they think about people they are friends with and their family members. So you can see here's data. Obviously, this is just a pictorial image of the brain, but regions in that area that is highlighted in green tend to show up when you run these kinds of studies. Participants engage this region the least when they think about people they know of, like celebrities. They engage it more to an intermediary degree when they think about friends and family, and the most when they think about themselves. For a while, social neuroscientists thought this had something to do with similarity to self, right? So many of our friends are similar to us, and so perhaps this intermediary amount of activity in response to friends is because of similarity to self. But Randy Buckner's group actually kind of nicely ruled out that possibility. So here you can see these are parameter estimates, and they had participants think about friends who are either similar to the self or dissimilar to the self, as well as strangers that are more or less similar to the self. And you can see that this region cares more about whether or not someone's your friend, as opposed to whether they're similar or dissimilar to you. Now, I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with sort of the constraints of this old school GLM approach to brain imaging data, right? So I might show more mean activity in medial prefrontal cortex when I think about myself, and then sort of an intermediary amount when I think about Luke, a friend, I think, and then the least to Kim Kardashian, who I know is not I'm pretty sure we're not friends, Kim and I. But this doesn't really give you evidence, right, of a shared representation. We want to move a little bit closer to a multivariate pattern approach. I'm sure Jim Haxby talked about this at length. It gives you a little bit more confidence that you're picking up on shared underlying representations, right? If two conditions have similar shared patterns in the same brain region, you're a little bit closer to representation. So that's the approach that Andrea and I wanted to take here. And this is the paradigm we used. Bless her heart, Andrea scanned 50 participants in like about 6 weeks or something here at Dartmouth in a place where the scanner is heavily used. So she blew my mind with her ability to collect data quickly. And the task, participants reflect on themselves sometimes. So you're just thinking about different targets, social targets in the scanner, and you're asked to indicate sort of in a binary way the extent to which the personality trait is a good description either of yourself, one of your friends like Luke or Kate, or some celebrity. The participants nominated the friends and acquaintances that they thought about in the scanner, but we sort of had everyone think about the same celebrities. We picked those 5. We confirmed with each participant that they knew who these celebrities were. But again, people self-nominated their own friends and acquaintances. About a week and a half before the scan, participants filled out a number of questionnaires, some of which were focused on this feeling of closeness to the self. So participants would rate on a 0 to 100 scale how emotionally close they feel to each of their friends, as well as each of their acquaintances, as well as each of the celebrities. And I'm not trying to differentiate Kate and Luke in terms of is one an acquaintance and one is a friend. I consider both of these folks friends. It's kind of awkward to call someone out as an acquaintance, so I just stuck friends here. And when you look at the closeness, I will call people out as acquaintances later, so. When you look at the closeness ratings, it's how you would expect, right? We have some variability. There is someone who feels like a 75 on 100 to one of the celebrities, but otherwise it seems to make sense, right? And so what we can do here is create a vector for each participant that's sort of idiosyncratic to each of their perceived closeness to each of the targets, right? So Warmer colors here indicate greater closeness, cooler colors indicate less closeness. And so there's, everyone's vector looks a little bit different, but we can create it for them. And in the scanner, remember they were thinking about these different people as well as themselves. And so we can run an analysis that looks for multivariate patterns that are similar to the self-conditioned patterns and that increase in similarity as a function of closeness. Because that's the idea of self-other overlap, is that the closer emotionally you feel to someone, the more you have a shared mental representation of them with yourself. And so when we run this kind of analysis, we indeed see a large swath of medial prefrontal cortex. We also see posterior and mid-cingulate. We didn't predict that up front, although it makes some intuitive sense. I'm happy to speculate on it later. And we also see a ton of visual cortex, which we definitely didn't predict. Happy to speculate on that too. But again, what we were primarily interested in was this medial prefrontal cortex region, and we do see it showing this pattern. Now, there's another way to think about this paradigm, especially if you're interested in multivariate patterns and how they're commonly represented across targets, right? So, sometimes participants are thinking about themselves in the scanner, but other times they're thinking about a whole cluster of people. They're not thinking about them at the same time, right? And you're only thinking about one person at a time in a trial, but there's some similarity in those folks, right? And they are different from the acquaintances. These are all folks I've met at Dartmouth, but I don't feel like I would call them a friend. I don't think they would call me a friend. And then there's like this category of people that you do know of, sort of from things like Us Weekly and the media. And what's important to point out is that it's possible that my brain similarly represents my friends, right? So not only might they vary in similarity to myself in terms of my closeness to them, but maybe my pattern in response to Luke is very similar in response to Jeremy and Kate and Caroline and Matt, and different than these other folks who don't necessarily know each other, but from my perspective are all acquaintances. And so Andrea and I have been referring to this as the click map. It's another way to think about how there might be pattern similarity throughout the brain in response to these targets. And indeed, when we run a searchlight analysis with this sort of theoretical matrix throughout the brain, we do see a ton of regions that seem to be mapping out the structure of our trial types in this way. Importantly, for our self-other overlap argument, we're seeing some of the same regions that we saw in that analysis, right? So medial prefrontal cortex, as well as posterior cingulate. We're also seeing some regions that we didn't see in that analysis. So temporal parietal junction, a region that's really quite consistently associated with theory of mind, right? Thinking about other people's mental states and beliefs, as well as temporal poles and mid-temporal gyrus regions associated with semantic knowledge in general, as well as social semantic knowledge and identity. So it makes sense, but from our purposes, it also is a little concerning, right? Because it could mean that there's a confound in our self-other overlap results that sort of also vary as a function of this structure, right? So what we really wanted to do next was have a single analysis that has both of these models in it, so that then we can look at one analysis, right, one model controlling for or partialing out whatever effects are driven by the other model, right? And so that's exactly what we ran next. So what I'm going to show you first is the data looking at the click map, sort of controlling for whatever is going on with self-other overlap. Perhaps unsurprising, it looks like the exact same image I showed you before, because this is like a really robust effect. It's not that surprising that self-other overlap would really change it. And this is where it gets a little scary for us, because then we think, oh, maybe our whole effect is being driven by this. But when we look at self-other overlap holding click map constant, we still see a healthy portion of medial prefrontal cortex, suggesting that despite this other structure in the stimuli, the closer emotionally you feel to someone, the more similar your medial prefrontal cortex seems to respond to that person relative to the self, if that makes sense. All right, the next thing we wanted to know is whether this neural similarity between the self and others in medial prefrontal cortex could get us, yeah, question.
If I could just ask about that analysis, is that based on a searchlight?
Yes, this one.
And you use correlation between the patterns? Is that true?
Yes, but they're independently looked at but put in the same regression model. Does that make sense? And which is what allows you to look at one holding the other one constant. All right, so what we next wanted to do was look into whether this self-other overlap in the brain could give us a little traction on loneliness, and here's why. So It turns out loneliness is really hard to study objectively, partly because subjective and objective indicators of social connection don't always hang together. A lot of times they do, but social scientists have seen that there's actually a really small correlation there. You can imagine there's some people who don't have a lot of objective social contacts, scientists, right, who don't feel lonely at all. There's like a lot of grad students who you might, think of in this, fall in this category, don't need a lot of social interaction and feel totally content with their number of social ties. On the flip side, there are a lot of people who look very well embedded in their social environment, have a lot of friends, but yet actually internally suffer from loneliness. And so the really only way to find out if someone's lonely or not is to just ask them with these sort of self-report questionnaires, which is fine, that's a useful approach, but it has made it hard to get at what sort of, you could argue more neurobiologically, is going on that underpins loneliness. And so Andrea and I were looking at those loneliness questionnaires, and these are sample items from them. And if you look closely at it, it sure sounds a lot like sort of a chronic lack of self-other overlap, right? People are around me physically, but not really with me. I feel isolated from others, not that you are physically isolated, but this feeling of distance between the self and others. And so what we did next was just a correlation analysis. For those of you who are interested or concerned, we used a independently defined ROI for our medial prefrontal cortex so that we weren't in the territory of double dipping, right? And on the x-axis is the UCLA loneliness scale. And y-axis again is self-other similarity in medial prefrontal cortex. And what you can see here is that across the social targets, we are seeing a correlation between loneliness and self-other similarity, such that the lonelier individuals show less similar underlying multivariate patterns between the selves and the other people, regardless of sort of what target a person is. All right, so just sort of to wrap up then, collectively, the results from this study were consistent with this really old idea in psychology, right? That interpersonal closeness does seem to be increasing self-other overlap here in a way that we're measuring with neuroimaging data. And one thing that at least Andrea and I are really excited about is that we feel like we've done better, right? We've done better than that single item questionnaire and have a like sort of harder evidence for this old idea. And that loneliness, this sort of chronic feeling at the trait level of being distant or disconnected from others, seems to be sort of mirrored, at least in just this correlational way, with less self-other overlap neurally in the brain. So that's the work with Andrea on sort of the subjective side of things. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question actually a couple slides back.
You can just say when.
So it kind of looks like there might be like an inverted U shape here, like
Oh.
the people with moderate amount of loneliness have the highest pattern similarity. Is that, am I looking at that correctly? Does that look like there might be a pattern? At least with the acquaintances.
People who are the loneliest have the highest? It looks like the...
A moderate level.
Oh, yeah. There's more spread. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. We haven't like tested for that. I will say that the weirdest results that we see when we start looking at the groups does happen in the acquaintances for the lonelier folks. So for example, one analysis we ran that's not on self-other similarity, but we wanted to know if like that clique structure would change for lonelier people. Sort of like that book by the Dartmouth alum Mindy Kaling, right? Like, is everyone hanging out without me? We thought like maybe lonely people would not only have distant self from other in terms of similarity, but also the others might be really close to one another, like they're all the same. We see something like that for the acquaintances for the lonelier folks if you do like a median split. So that's not really answering your question except to say that, yeah, something is going on with acquaintances.
Sorry,
Yeah.
could that be just there's more data for the middle range?
Oh, like more people fall in the, yeah, that's true. That's another way, yeah. Most people aren't like super lonely or like, oh, I always feel super connected. Yes.
Especially acquaintances, 'cause like everybody-
Yes. And the acquaintance thing too is also weird because there could also be a bias in who people nominate if they are lonelier. So yeah, there's a number of things that could be allowed. That's a good point. All right, yeah, so that's the subjective side of social connection. Now we can sort of switch gears and focus on the objective side of things. And here in this project, sorry, Alex and I have been thinking about how our different sort of internal subjective states, our affective states rather, might push around how much we want to go out and engage with our social environment. So how does our subjective experience change our engagement with our objective social network, right? And one of the mental states we're really interested in here is stress. And this is because we've known for a while now that having more social ties, greater social connection is mental and health protective. It's good for your health. Of course, we've known for a while that stress is bad for mental and physical health, right? It thwarts mental and physical health. And so Alex and I were wondering about this bit here, right? How might stress intervene on social connection and create this sort of negative cycle between more stress, less social connection, and exacerbated mental and physical health issues? So that's sort of the big picture, what was guiding our thinking. And if you just type stress into Google Images, like I did a couple nights ago, you'll get images that look like this. These are the images that you'll see. And if you just look at these images, it's pretty clear that there's something about stress that makes you want to like shut out the world around you, right? I mean, these are actors in stock photos, but they seem to mirror how we think about stress. Right, you close your eyes, you shut out your ears, or you cover your ears. You're trying to disengage from the environment around you. A lot of our environment is social, so it seems pretty reasonable to think that maybe when you're the most stressed, you're the least likely, or you're not very likely to go out and interact with people in your social world. Turns out Alex and I are definitely not the first people to come up with this possibility. There's actually a really huge literature on what's often called stress-induced social avoidance, which I think kind of says it all in the name, right? There's this idea, and there's evidence for this idea that increasing stress has a causal impact on socializing such that it thwarts socializing, right? And what's interesting about this literature is that it's actually virtually all in animals, in rodent models. And so I'm just going to walk you through sort of how the typical rodent model or study unfolds in this kind of approach. So it typically unfolds over 2 days. And on day 1, the researchers stress out a rat or a mice. It's run in both kinds of rodents. Sometimes the stressor is social, like a social defeat manipulation. Other times it's totally physical, like electric shocks, being shown here. So that's day 1. On day 2, they then give the rat the option to socialize. There's this little tunnel, and the door is closed until the experimenter is like, go, and he removes the door, he or she, and then the animal can see that like down the tunnel they could walk down and hang out with this other rat who there's like this plexiglass, I don't know, it's complicated, but he can go and hang out with the other rat, or just kind of look at the rat and like get all in his face. Seems like the 2 options, right? Turns out, so clearly I'm not an animal researcher. Turns out non-stressed rats spend about 90% of their time socializing with the other rat. Like they'll go in and hang out. But the stress rats actually spend less than 50% of their time socializing with the other rat. That's like a really big effect, right? And it's one that replicates again and again. If you type stress-induced social avoidance in Google Scholar, you'll get a ton of papers. It replicates so much that animal researchers aren't like even studying this behavior so much anymore, but have like moved on and are interested in the genetic and molecular factors that influence this kind of behavior, right? So it's really well replicated. And it's so well replicated that the paradigm has even been used to test the effectiveness of anxiolytics prescribed to humans. So erasing this effect has been taken as a sign that some anxiolytic prescribed to humans might be a good way to treat generalized anxiety or social anxiety, right? Where you might imagine stress induces social avoidance. But here's the rub. The really weird thing is that it doesn't seem like anyone has really tested whether stress causally induces social avoidance in humans. This is the one study Alex and I could find testing this idea. It's possible that Alex and I aren't good at finding the literature. Like that's a possibility, but we've read recent review papers from the animal literature, and they make note of the fact that there's a lack of research in humans, so it's not just our Google Scholar skills. There really is not much work on this area in humans, except for this one study that Alex and I could find. I'm not going to go over the results of this study because they're really, really inconclusive. They're all over the place, and they're really hard to interpret. But it's worth thinking about how they chose to measure stress-induced social avoidance in humans. So participants were randomly assigned to be stressed, and then they were seated in front of a computer, and they would see faces one at a time on the computer screen with emotional expressions, and the subjects had a lever or a joystick, and they were just tasked with pulling the lever towards or away from themselves in response to each image. And moving the lever away from yourself was taken as evidence of social avoidance. The results are a mess. They're really hard to interpret. But maybe because pulling a lever towards and away from yourself is not the most ecologically valid way to measure social behavior. In fact, nobody in this experiment is interacting with anyone. And I don't know about you, but pulling a lever doesn't really feel like what it's like to go out in the world and socialize with people. So again, in the lab, we want to know if we could do better, right? Alex and I wanted to know if we could test for stress-induced social avoidance in humans more naturalistically. And this project is in collaboration not just with Alex, but also Andrew Campbell, who's a really awesome computer scientist here at Dartmouth. And Andrew Campbell and his group have developed this app, this smartphone app. They call it the Student Life app. And it's really cool. So in these data sets that they've collected on Dartmouth undergrads, each night they answer a little question about how stressed they are. It might be a little hard to see, but they're a bunch of images, and they just tap the image that reflects their stress level. Part of the reasoning for asking it this way instead of some sort of old school psych way is because it's easier to get people to do this over a long period of time, right? They just get dinged in the evening and they can pick the image and then they move on. So they are able to get larger sort of longitudinal data sets. Now, in addition to that sort of random self-report question, they also are using passive mobile sensing, which means that on the app, there are classifiers that can detect whether the undergraduates who are participating are engaged in all kinds of behaviors. So it can detect whether a participant is socializing through conversation. It can detect if the participant is sleeping, whether they're out walking around, moving around in their environment. There are actually many features that they can detect, but I'm not going to go over all of them because it's actually like an insane amount. At the end of the day, the data set Alex and I are working with has 74 participants, each with 64 days of data on average. And the variable that Alex and I are most interested in, right, is this conversation variable. It's the variable that most closely mirrors social interaction, right, in real life. The approach we took to asking our questions is dynamic multi-level modeling. I put a plug for the R package that we've been using because we really liked it. It uses a graphical Gaussian model framework. I've included a suggested reading here if any of you have similar data and you're interested in like playing around with these methods yourself. Alex and I have been reading a bunch of papers on this topic. They vary in how helpful they are. This one I highly recommend. It's really clear, it's really thorough, and it's also written by the guy who wrote the R package, so they kind of like go together really nicely. So this approach, what it does is with these long time series of data, it generates 3 networks. And they are called networks because the variables, you typically have more than 2 in these kinds of analyses, right? We have a number of variables we're interested in. And the variables are connected by edges, and the edges just reflect the strength of the relationship between any 2 variables. Pretty straightforward. A nice feature of this approach is that all of the graph edges are partial correlations, which means that if we see a relationship, for example, between stress and socializing, whatever the strength of that relationship is sort of controlling for or independent of the relationship between stress and sleep, for example. So that image there is just as somebody else's data, actually one network. Like I mentioned, this approach generates 3 different networks. The network Alex and I are most interested in is the temporal network. This is because it gets us closer to this idea of causality. It's obviously not causality, but we could get into the area of prediction, right? How does stress level at a given time relate to socializing later? So that's the one we're most interested in. But the approach also generates a between subjects network, so that lets you answer questions like, are students who are more stressed on average also the least social on average? And then this contemporaneous network, which is basically like everything left over that hasn't been accounted for by the other 2 networks. They refer to it as a contemporaneous network. It's also within subjects, and it just gives you a snapshot of how your variables relate to one another within subjects on a given day, controlling for the temporal effects and controlling for the between subjects effects. So I'm just going to show you, this is our data now, the results from the contemporaneous network. And red dashed lines indicate a negative association. Green lines indicate a positive association, and the thickness of the line, I should say edge, indicates the strength of the association, though I'm only showing you statistically significant associations. And so you can see here in this contemporaneous network, we are seeing a negative relationship, right, between how stressed a participant rates themselves as feeling and socializing or sociality, and then it's a negative one. And again, this is more just how are these two variables or this set of variables related on a given day. But what Alex and I really wanted to do was sort of better mirror the paradigms in the animal literature, right? Where in this area of research, they stress out the animal on day one, and then they wait a whole day and look at socializing the next day. And that's the information we get from the Temporal Network, which was using a one-day delay as the lag. And we do see, that's why there's the check, that there is a negative relationship such that greater stress on a given day predicts less socializing the next day within subjects, and not the other way around. There are times, so for example, movement in home, you can see that it's bi-directional. The stress and socializing one seems to be going in one direction. If you're interested in why there's these green arrows that are sort of iterative onto themselves, that's because you can look at, for example, does greater socializing on a given day predict within subjects greater socializing the next day? That seems to be the case for all of our variables here except for sleep. Maybe if you sleep a lot one day, you don't need as much sleep the next day. I don't know. I'm not a sleep researcher. What's interesting for us is that there is this prediction between greater stress on a given day and less socializing the next day. There's still stuff to think about. So this one really made us scratch our heads. Why does greater socializing on a given day predict being at home more the next day? As a fairly introverted person, when I saw that, I thought, oh, that makes sense. That's like when you have one of those days where you engage in a lot of socializing and then it's totally exhausting the next day. Then in conversation with Alex, we realized we could be picking up on something else going on here. These undergraduates, when they're socializing a lot, might also be partying, so we might be picking up on some sort of hangover effect, right? Future work can pit these possibilities against one another. Not super relevant to our question. Again, what we really cared about was this relationship. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that by no means do I want to create like a strong parallel between our experiment and the animal work that's different in a number of ways. However, in the animal literature, our read from it anyways, it seemed hard to disambiguate whether the rats who were stressed and not approaching the other animal, whether it's because they were trying to avoid social interaction or if because they were sort of freezing and just don't want to move around. A nice thing in our results is that these two things seem to separate because these are all partial correlations. We do see that stress on a given day relates to less movement the next day, but it's still sort of independently relating to less socializing the last day. Is there a question? Yeah.
Are your time samples like equally distributed throughout the quarter? Because you could imagine there could be like local differences, like beginning of the quarter maybe you're trying to socialize more. And at the end of the quarter maybe you're more stressed.
So we haven't looked at that, but we could. So almost like this is collapsing across and treating it all as the same across the whole quarter, but we could look at that sort of in almost like a sliding window kind of way. That would be interesting. Yeah, we haven't. Go ahead.
And relate it, I think, like partial out to like the day of the week, so like
Yeah.
weekdays and sociality.
It could let us get at the hangover effect because you would imagine that'd be larger on the weekends. Yeah.
Yeah, I might have missed it, but when you measure stress, can you know what type of stress?
No.
Learning related or socially related?
No, this is driving me nuts. No. So we don't know if it's exams, if it's, no, we don't know. It would be nice moving forward to have a question added so that we could, get at if it's a social stressor or if it's academic, that kind of thing. All right, cool. And this is our between subjects network. It's really interesting in that there isn't much interesting going on. So it doesn't seem to be the case that on average over the quarter, it's not that people who are more stressed are also the least social. The only between subjects effects we're getting at is that people who are home more tend to move around less, and people who move around more are more social. But otherwise, not a lot of action there. To return to what we were originally trying to get at, right? We knew previously in rodents that inducing stress on day one inhibits quote unquote socializing on day two. And now we're seeing in humans greater self-reported stress on a given day predicts less socializing through conversation the next day. In terms of why this all matters, sort of in a big picture way, psychologists, sort of health psychologists and social psychologists have known for a while, since like the mid-'80s, that one of the best ways to guard against the negative impacts of stress on health is to go out and seek social support. Specifically, there's a lot of work looking at through conversation, right? Emotional disclosures, talking to other people. There's a lot of work in this area. It's often referred to as the buffering hypothesis. And of course, our data is just from one sample, from one group of Dartmouth students. But it's interesting to think about how on the times when they're actually the most stressed, they seem to be engaging in the least conversation, suggesting they might not be making use of this strategy of the social support buffering hypothesis. And so with that, I just want to sort of wrap up. We were talking about two different sides of social connection, right? On the subjective side of things, we saw work from Andrea Courtney showing that self-other overlap seems to be mirrored by pattern similarity in medial prefrontal cortex, and that feelings of stress seem to hamper our desire to go out and engage in social interactions. And so with that, I would just like to remind you all to stay connected. Not only is it fun, but it's good for you. And I'd like to thank the members of my lab, especially Andrea and Alex, who did, as I said, the heavy lifting on these two projects. Thanks.
Time for a few questions.
Since Kate is here, no, I'm just wondering, it's just like these two really interesting data sets, right? You were looking at exploration and movement, and you're looking at well-being and social interactions. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about how putting all of these together?
I didn't go to her talk. No, I didn't go to your talk. I was writing this talk, so sorry.
One line synopsis is we're sort of looking at using GPS measures, looking at physical exploration, and found that individuals, one relationship that we have to any sort of social measures, we found that individuals who have sort of higher entropy in their distribution of time across physical locations have larger social networks.
Oh.
And our kind of preliminary interpretation is something like people who like having diversity of experience, like across multiple domains or something like that.
Oh, that's cool.
But what, was there a, like...
Yeah, it looks like there are a lot of factors, because here I think there was no relationship to actual physical exploration, right?
Well, stress is sort of independently in the temporal network affecting both. But if in terms of movement and sociality, I think we did see something in the contemporaneous networks on a given day within subjects. There is a really strong positive relationship, like I guess what you're seeing, that people who are socializing more are also moving around more, which is interesting.
Movement measure, sort of just like an overall activity measure?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we found no, like our effects were sort of unrelated to activity itself versus, so it may be more consistent than
I see.
on the surface.
Right.
It wasn't the movement itself that had more to do with
Like navigating around. Oh, that's cool. I think we can find that out in this data set. They do, like, we're not looking at it here. We're collapsing across movement, but they do. It's like the Black Mirror like study of Dartmouth students. They like know like where they are exactly. It's kind of creepy. So we could figure out, that kind of question. Yeah.
Any other questions?
So in the mental health world, there's some people have studied like dependent social stress, which is stress that people have some role in, just they're involved in the interaction that leads to stress. So I was wondering if you think there might be any role in after a very stressful day and decreasing your socialization in order to, decrease the risk of causing like harm in your social networks or something like that.
Oh, that's interesting. That it's like protective, so that you don't stress out the other person, like with your issues, or.
Stress like a person to do with reassurance seeking that might have a long-term negative impact on relationships.
Right.
Kind of more generally feckless in your
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm not sure, and this is definitely like a new space for me. Like Luke thought I was going to give a different talk because I haven't been a stress researcher at all. One thing to think about is like this population though too. I don't know if undergraduate conversation is really the best way to get at sort of social support-ish like interactions. I don't know that when they are talking to each other, how much they're really like helping each other and whatnot, or if they're having sort of superficial conversations. and we can't really get at that with this data.
Reverse of that also holds. If you have a network that you can't talk to when you're stressed out, that's not great. It's not
Right.
a great network.
Right.
So it still fits, I think.
Right.
If you're avoiding, and when you're stressed too much, it means maybe the connections are not good enough or something.
Right. It's cyclical.
So you went through it pretty quick, and the images were kind of small, but the images that the subjects click on the
Yeah.
could that give you some of your indicator as to what kind of stress they might be feeling, or
Oh,
what
that's a good
type of,
idea.
like happiness they might be feeling if they're having a non-stress day? Like one that stood out to me was like the clock, the alarm.
Right.
If I'm thinking about a test that I have to take in the morning, perhaps that is going to lead me to click on the clock, or if I'm
Yeah.
having a stressed out social day, maybe it's a personal stressed out. I don't know, just if there's more information in that naturalistic stimulus set that you're actually presenting.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, I really like that idea. Certainly, we could try to classify the actual images and see if there's information in there about the source of their stress, kind of thing. That's cool.
Like even if you can't parcel it out in your own analysis, like based on what their activities are, you just present it to some like Amtrak or something and say, how does this picture make you feel?
Right. Yeah, that's a good idea.
To know what they're associated with.
Cool, thanks. I want to make sure Mark has time. One more, or okay.
Maybe, Jay, last question.
Yeah.
Have you mapped out the structure of these people's networks?
No, I think that is something that Alex would want to do. One thing to keep in mind is that, like, it would be cool if like the whole class had this app, for example. And actually, there might be a Dartmouth class that will have that. So, if the whole undergrad first year students had this app, then you could start to see who's like friends with who's, and then connect the dots between who's talking to who and who's most stressed, blah, blah, blah. We don't have that information in this data set. I think in this data set, like for IRB purposes, like we're not allowed to know. But moving forward, that would be cool. I think one of the things Alex wanted to do was see how like the social network is changing over time, especially with stress. Yeah.
Yeah, the data set's really wild. Like, I can't really go into details, but it's like what they swiped at the cafeteria, like what their GPA is, it's dense sampling over the entire like 4 years they're here. It's like so there's just like a lot of privacy, and so they do a lot of the process online, so it doesn't actually say it's all anonymized. Anyway, it's really cool. They actually the pilot of this is available to publicly download online.
Yeah, and actually, I think this is the pilot data, which is part of it.
The question about casing the GPS data isn't very good on that particular because it would bounce to different Wi-Fi nodes. I think they fixed it.
Cool.
All right, let's take
Cool. Thanks.